Hi, this is Steve Addison for the Movements Podcast, the podcast for people who want to multiply disciples and churches everywhere. Today we're talking about breaking up hard ground, and we're having a conversation with someone we'll call Park, who's based in Istanbul.
We've been here in Turkey for the last 3.5 years. We came from serving prior to that in various parts of the U.S. and felt a significant call to be here. And so we've been laboring away trying to get our feet under us. We made it through our first term of service here. We're into term 2 and feeling more at home in the field that God's called us to. It was a challenge to come with a bunch of small ones and get settled into a mega city. We've made it through the sort of extreme parts of the culture shock and culture stress, and now feel like we don't feel like we're locals. We don't feel at ease, but we feel a lot more at ease than we used to, and much more able to actually do what we came here to do, to share the love of Jesus.
What were a couple of the challenges you faced in that first term of adjustment?
We had a few. I personally had a few strong concerns in my head and my heart, knowing we were feeling called to come. We're coming with small children. And at the time, our kids were between the ages of 8 and just over, close to 1.5. And so it felt like, man, can we do this to our kids? Can we bring, what will this do to our kids to pick them up and take them? Now, we knew we had wise mentors and folks who have run a lot farther in the race than we have to encourage us that, your kids are, God is with you. Your kids are resilient. You guys are a good family. You're going to be okay. God's going to be with you in it. They were 100% right. What I was most concerned about was the culture shock, the language barrier and the totally different culture and religion. And what actually was the most difficult for the longest was being in such a massive city. We came from small towns mostly. Even the places we lived when we lived in cities were still rather comfortable and almost suburban. And now we're in, a really urban environment, and with a bunch of small kids who aren't used to dodging minibuses and motorbikes that ride on the sidewalks and things like that. So it was like we were at 95% capacity stress level as a daily reality for a while, and then having to figure out how to work around what felt like a no English environment when we got here.
Yeah. Okay. And how did you come through that?
Well, we didn't feel like there was an alternative. So, you just kind of keep going. Thankfully, we had some good teammates, and there were quite a few of them. Basically, all of us were first termers together, just about. And we were all sort of struggling through some of the same things. So we could all look at each other and go, well, I guess I'm not the crazy one. We're either all crazy or none of us are crazy, because we're dealing with this same thing at the same time. In a lot of ways, that was really helpful. A thing that was really helpful was connecting with some folks who had served here for quite a few more years than us, and had gotten to a place of much greater peace in their and stability in their ability to live here, serve here, and function in healthy ways. And that really gave me a glimpse of what I was hoping to become as a worker in this place. Like, man, I want to feel like that. I want to have that peace in my presence, when I'm here. And little by little, we've experienced that, more and more. And it's a big shift, so it takes time to make it through a big shift.
Yeah, and in the middle of that, for various reasons, you lost some team members that had to leave the country. So I guess some of the people going that journey, all of a sudden they're gone. and you're a bit more isolated.
Yeah, we at one point, when we entered, we were the fourth family to arrive here. Um, one, two, three, four. Yeah, we were the fourth family to arrive. Another one came shortly after us. And at the height of numbers of, of unit families here, I think we had eight different families. And when we gathered for church in one of our homes each week, there were, 10 adults and I don't know, a dozen kids, something like that, all sort of 8 or 9 years old and younger. So there was a lot of life, and it was chaotic, actually, really, really actually hard to manage in a urban apartment.
Mm.
But we made it work, and we were grateful to have people to labor with, to share life with. There's a bit of a sliding scale in terms of how much we didn't all go out together. We didn't all go do the work together at the same time in the same places. We had some different focus areas, and it was encouraging to feel like we had a good crowd around us. And then fast forward to the present, we're just two families from the eight or however many it was. And so our teammates and we work really closely together, live really closely together, and have a great relationship. We came up at a similar time, so we're able to kind of function in similar uh, degrees of ability.
Mm.
And yeah, it's been God's grace that He's kept us here. The issues for most have just been visa issues or sense of calling to another place, something like that. So everybody, for the most part, has either made the choice to leave or they were never given the choice to stay in the first place.
Mm.
They just never could get a yes on a permit. So it's felt more and more like a sign of God's grace that He's allowed us to come here, to be here, to stay here. And so we're, yeah, continuing to do the work as much as we can for as long as the Lord will let us keep
Mm.
calling this country our host home.
How's it gone, sort of entering into unreached fields, looking for those God-prepared people? How did you get started?
Yeah, it's it's been a challenge in a number of ways. I feel like we've finally gotten our feet a little bit more under us recently, and we came in on our teammates and we had a pretty significant amount of experience prior to hitting the field. Like we had been disciple makers and church planters, and had developed leaders and things like this before we got here. And then we show up in our target people group and our focus, our majority people here. There's 63 million of them in the country. There's 20 million people in our city. Huge, vast majority are majority people. But we're talking about maybe 8,000 believers in this country amongst the majority people. Maybe.
Mm.
It is shocking. I've been to church services in the States with more people in the service
Yeah.
than there are local believers here.
Yeah.
And that's shocking. But when we got here, I'll tell you something that I didn't expect, Steve. We started to ask questions. We had been doing this work, but in our home culture, in our home context environment before coming here. And so then we land in a cross-cultural setting, feeling like, man, how do we do it here? There's security concerns. There's just a lot of things that are different, a whole different sort of operating system when it comes to people's worldview. They're
Mm.
Eastern people. They're Islamic. They're people with a very distinct sense of identity that's separate from any other people around. That we're not the Middle East. We're not Central Asia. We're not Europe. We're not,
Mm.
whatever you want to say. We are us. That's who we are. And so we started to ask, I started to ask when I would find older, more experienced people here, hey, what mistakes do you see people making when they come here? What are you seeing God do? How are you guys laboring? And I kept hearing story after story of how some people would come here and foolishly think they could do what they did somewhere else,
Mhm.
that they could quickly start to share the gospel with someone, whether it's through an English speaking person, whether it's through, learning basic Turkish and speaking with a local and communicating in that way. And I just heard over and over, it's not safe. You'll get kicked out. People won't receive that. The gospel, it takes a while. You really need to get at the roots of their worldview and uproot that from the deepest parts up. In some cases, you shouldn't be sharing for a while with
Mm.
people. And I heard this for so many,
Mm.
from so many people, so many times in so many different ways. And I thought, man, wow, I got here and I was so foolish to think that I should just start sharing the gospel and
Mm.
I should do what I've been doing. Maybe I better, these guys, they've been here for a long time. They've got to
Mm.
be right. And of course, sometimes just a little bit like a bony fish, there's meat there, but you have to spit out the bones. And so I got good feedback. I got good
Yeah.
advice. I got good counsel on a lot of things, but I also choked on some bones, so to speak.
Mm.
And so we heard that and thought, well, we want to be good stewards of the work that God's entrusting to us, the access He's giving us. And so we actually eased back and sort of shrunk back from being more bold. We were sharing our testimonies, we were sharing the gospel
Mm.
some, but it was slow and infrequent. And we're just focusing on learning the language. And there wasn't much in the way of English around us anyway. So it was really an internal struggle more
Mm.
so than a refusal on our part to share something like that. It wasn't quite to that degree, but it really kind of affected us for a while. And we ended up having to just sort of come full circle again. It started the first time when we were in our home country, back in the States, working through this, becoming disciple makers and church planters and so on in the States. We sort of had to rediscover it from the scriptures, right here in Turkey. Say like, well, we're here amongst this people who basically never hear the gospel. There are workers here who do share. There are churches who do proclaim the gospel, but they're not a lot. And actually, I hear more stories of people who come and then their work is to try to stay.
Mm.
And now, don't get me wrong, I really want to stay and keep
Yeah.
laboring.
Yeah.
But I also started to struggle with what are we doing here? Or
Mm.
this this can't be right. You started to hear not what sounded like wisdom and advice, but what then started to sound like I don't know, this sort of lie we've told ourselves that
Mm.
keeps getting passed around. And so it was helpful to hear from other brothers and sisters in other similar type environments in the region, to hear some of the what you can't do's in other places. What are the lines that people draw, either amongst local believers or amongst the worker community in your countries? We thought, that sounds just like where we are. But we heard stories of them breaking through that in their context.
Mm.
We thought, yeah, that's right. And so it was just God's timing and His grace that about the time we could start to communicate a bit more, we were starting to push a little harder on some of those things. And
Have you
so,
have
yeah.
you got a story that helps us understand an example of how you've pushed a bit harder with a specific person or situation?
Yeah, we had some very low bars in our minds when we were recently arrived, and we were starting to use these kind of um, Luke 10 says to give your peace to someone and to have them return it back. You're looking for the person of peace, the one who returns your peace to you. And so we were using these sort of salty statements, you could say, trying to see if I say something that is somewhat spiritual, will they perk their ears up? And it seemed like a good idea, but it never worked. And so we were trying these little salty statements, wondering, is this how we get to a gospel conversation? And we would toy with different things, but it didn't ever really land. It just wasn't a productive or fruitful thing. It was too distant, too impersonal. And at some point, we just said, I think we just need to go and share the gospel
Mm.
with somebody, and I hope we won't get kicked out of the country for it. We've done a lot of work already. I hope we don't get kicked out for it. And so we just kind of started going two by two to pray, and to try to offer prayer to people. But really, as we're in our communities, I noticed a difference here is that it is not hard to get to know who's in your neighborhood and for them to know who you are. I occasionally get mixed up for, just this week was with a friend who's visiting, and I was helping him check into a hotel, and I was talking with the hotel guy, and the guy just thought I was Turkish. I just started speaking Turkish with him, and from time to time I get that. Now I'm no, don't misunderstand. I'm not like some native level fluent guy or anything like that. And, but Turks have a very broad type of looks to them, from the European looking all the way to very dark skinned, dark hair, dark features. And so I could pass for one on a good day, and sometimes it happens. But what I noticed is when we would look for opportunities, not just to share a salty statement, not just to pray as we go, not just to even ask, "Can I pray for you?" but to get into spiritual conversation, to ask someone, "Hey, so by the way, are you a Muslim? Are you a religious person? I'm curious." We would open conversations actually pretty quickly with people. And so I'll give you one really concrete example. Just this morning, all my kids were up late with some friends last night. They were all sleeping, but the baby went to bed at the normal hour, and he's almost 2. He's not really a baby. He woke up at the early hour, and he's a social guy, so he'll wake everybody up if I hang around. So I said, "Let's just go for a walk, bud." We went out, early morning walk in the neighborhood. And as we're out in the square, there's a big statue of the founder of the country. It's an amphitheater they've built. There's birds pigeons feeding and things like that. And then just a couple of people out. And he goes and walks around a corner, and he happens to see a guy working for the city who's sweeping up trash and cleaning up a bit. And, my boy will just kind of stand there and look and wave, and mumble, his baby speak to him. And people here love kids. So it's a wonderful entry strategy, and, just a beautiful thing. And the guy waved at him, and, the guys that work in that job, they aren't necessarily the quickest to communicate with you, but he just was really friendly. And I just said, "Good morning," and we started chatting a bit. And we were chatting about how he was upset that a bunch of people had left a mess, as it's his job. And he's like, who's so disrespectful they would leave it like this? I said, "Yeah, it's a shame." And then he kind of walked off, but I thought, there's no one else here. My son is doing great. He's staying with me. We're in a safe spot. I can try to have more of a conversation with this guy right now, even though it's just me with my little guy. And so I called him back. "Oh, hey, by the way, I wondered, is there anything we can pray for you about? When we pray, we like to pray for people. We're walking around. Can we pray for you? And by the way, what's your name?" And he said, "Yeah, you can pray for peace for me." He's like, "You could pray that I could be married. I really want to be married, but I'm single. And you could just pray that I would have health, because without health, nothing is good, right?" And these are common types of responses, fairly general. The "I want to be married" thing was a little bit more revealing. But then I said, "Oh, so are you Muslim?" He goes, "Well, I'm Zaza, which is one of the largest UPGs here in the country." And come to find out, we probably had a 15-minute conversation about the gospel. Now, he is devoutly Muslim, and fully in disagreement about the gospel. But I got to share the gospel with him, and we got to speak in depth about his beliefs and his thoughts on Islam, and how he understands what the message of the gospel is. And we're just doing this at 7 a.m. in the square when no one else is awake, because I just remembered I need to talk. I just need to talk to the guy. I'll be ashamed. I'll feel ashamed of myself if I don't say, like, it's just such a good opportunity. And it went great, he was so friendly to it. And here's this guy who probably has never actually met a Christian, never actually heard someone share the gospel before, and it's happening. And then we go from there. And in the course of just walking around for an hour with my, almost 2-year-old son, we got to share with a couple of neighbors. We got to offer prayer to a couple more people. And uh, I mean, candidly, Steve, I wasn't out in the harvest, so to speak. Like I wasn't going out with the intention of doing field work, if we want to put it that way. I'm just trying to get my son to not wake everybody up early.
Mm.
But once we started to see opportunities and we learned how to actually get the gospel out of our mouths in a decent way,
Yeah.
come to find out, you actually can share with just about anybody.
Mm.
And we're trying to continually look for, hey, what's the next step of recognizing it, taking that step, seeing the opportunity, taking the opportunity. And then little by little, as we meet maybe a believer, or somebody like that, we get to bring them in with us. At least let them see someone intentionally sharing the gospel and not sort of shrinking back away from it, or not insisting that the method of sharing happens in the context of a church building, or from a professional or something like that. And so for us, it's been really encouraging. Like, well, there's nothing but lostness here.
Yeah.
So, if we can just make sure we keep our eyes on that and try to keep ourselves available to have those conversations, sometimes they can go a while. They don't always go straight to the heart. And there are lots of times we feel like we're bouncing off a wall. Like I shared, and they did not get that. They just did not land. It was a first, first soil seed being sown on the path, and Satan just snatching it up kind of experience. And there are times where we can see that really clearly. It just doesn't land. But here we're having a conversation over whether my 2-year-old son is a sinner or not. I'm like, I've seen him in our house. I didn't teach him to sin, but he sins against his brothers and sisters a lot. And he's like, nah. But here, sin is the dividing line. And we're starting to find, what are the things that we can agree on? What are the things that they understand? What are the concepts that truly confront the worldview of your average, either Muslim or just Turkish person in general? And little by little, trying to recalibrate to make sure that as we communicate the gospel, we're getting across the pieces that people need to understand to see what it is we're actually sharing. But feels like we're at least getting to make some progress, and we're certainly getting to share with more people these days. That's been a real encouragement.
Yeah. What else are you doing in this sort of pioneer phase of the work? What does it look like?
Yeah, we've tried. Really, we work in the context of what we call are sort of the 3 lanes to movement. There are 3 common practices, types of work that have historically gotten to multiplication. One is 0 to 1, being with lost people, sharing the gospel and discipling them. Second one would be networking, finding like-minded believers that we can do something together with. And then the other is training and coaching. So as we find like-minded people who are asking for some help on how to make disciples, offer training to them, for free, to walk with them, and serve them as they go. And, we were in prior seasons doing a lot of training in some places, doing a lot of coaching, doing some networking, things like that. We are just focused really heavily on 0 to 1 in this context. We've done some networking, met people. But really in this context, what we've discovered is, now there are a lot of, precious believers who are serving the Lord here, but in ways that are really not likely for us to be able to, not a lot of compatibility. I'll put it that way. And so on one end, you've got the kind of multiplication-minded people that are coming with a very different yoke, a very different sort of strategy and process and set of principles that they bring to it. So we have a lot in common, but when it comes to the ground level, we sort of disagree on some fundamental components of how do you engage? What do you do next? What are you looking for? What are you trying to cultivate? Then on the other end, you have a very sort of formalized, traditional, established church culture that, though there are few churches, there's less than 200 in the whole country, there is a strong amount of sort of protectiveness as well as a strong authority structure. And so if you're working within that system, you work within that system. But our heart is not to try to force people to do anything our way. So we've made some connections and relationships, but for the most part, we're like, man, what we want to see is lostness being engaged. We want to see the priesthood of the believer, sort of released to all believers. And if we're ever in situations where that is going to just clash really hard, cause nothing but division and no real progress, then we're staying away from that kind of stuff. And so we've done some networking, to connect some relationships. It's helped us learn a bit. It's helped us get a sense of where is God at work? Where does he have his people at work? What can we be focusing on where it's sort of uncontested, that we're not going to become unhelpful voices in a place where there's already some voices. And there's lots of opportunity in that. And when we've done training, it's been, we used to do lots of event trainings. But since we've been here in country, we've trained, I don't know that we've trained more than one person at a time. And probably I could count on both hands, possibly one hand, the number of people I could say we've trained. And often that's looked more like, as we've met a believer and we're trying to find out, is this a person, can we communicate clearly enough such that they know what we're pursuing, that we can walk with them and help them follow Jesus and make disciples? And then if so, can we give them some basic equipping? And so, I don't remember who it was that said, people don't rise to the occasion, they fall to the level of their training. And so in those times, it's like, well, we know what to do when we have someone who is saying, I want to make a disciple, And so we just sort of, even without practicing that training in Turkish, we backed our way into it and had to kind of work our way through it in the Turkish that we had in order to pass that along. But part of the reason is there's not been opportunities for that. So, in God's timing, he'll open up more of those doors, give us more opportunities to function in some of those ways. But the real need of the hour in this country is seeing people praying and sharing the good news directly. Like, people here just need to hear the gospel. The types of broad seed sowing that have happened historically here have been things like Bible distribution, and that has been a significant component in the sort of spiritual life of the people who are now the body of Christ in Turkey. So we praise the Lord for that. But there hasn't been a lot of mouth to ear communication of the gospel, in neighborhoods and homes in the community outside of church buildings. And I've heard more of not quite suppression, but an encouragement to slow down more often. And I've actually been really surprised by that. So for us, it feels like the big, even just sharing and then sharing about sharing with like-minded or potentially like-minded people is a big deal. And then being able to do that when we have a disciple or two that we're walking with, it kind of come, from time to time, we've had people that we're walking with. Just doing that is a part of strong discipleship with those folks. Just modeling that we don't tuck our heads in and hide. We need to be wise and understand that it is a costly thing, a potentially costly thing to share openly, but that it's worth it, and that we're not gonna model fear. We're gonna model wise boldness in our context. And so I think, we're just trying to honor the Lord with that. But in this season, it's what the work looks like. I was even not warned exactly, but I was encouraged to recognize, as I talked to a brother who was serving here in country before we moved here, I said, hey, brother, I wanted to put this in front of you. We're thinking the Lord might be calling us here. What do you think? And he said, well, you need to decide whether you're willing to operate in a 0 to 1 type of posture. Like, are you willing to just be about sharing the gospel with lost people? Because there's not much else to do here right now. And it was helpful to be sort of confronted with that question, because it set the tone for my expectations. We've had A handful, maybe a few people that we've seen receive baptism here since we've arrived. That who are locals. Of course, there have been. The challenge is there's a much more fruitful lane right next to Turkish people in the country.
With Persians,
Iranians,
Afghans.
with Persians, with Afghans, with Kurdish people,
Kurds,
Arabs, particularly Syrians, things like that. And so the Lord is doing some great things amongst these really precious people in a very, very hard life circumstance here. And then it just feels like crickets a lot of times. We've seen amongst Turkish people, a few people receive baptism, separate from each other. They each have, cool stories of how it's come about, just the way God connects things in his grace, a guy getting a dream and being on a spiritual journey and that kind of thing. And then encountering some young brothers who've just come to spend a few months with us. And they're walking with him, having late night conversations for hours and hours and hours. And God just gave them to him, and God gave him to them, if that makes sense in that season. Just a couple of our teammates were newly arrival people. They were only here for about a year, but they were trying to order a hamburger at a little local restaurant one day and struggling to communicate that in Turkish to the waiter. And a girl beside them hears them and says, "You guys need help. Let me help you." She spoke good English and helped them out. But they met with her, shared with her, she came to faith, and they were able to baptize her. And so they started to meet for a while until she moved away to do university in another country, graduate program. We've got one guy who's a newer believer, a couple years. A friend of mine led him to faith a couple years ago. He's a part of that guy's church, and but that guy decided to leave the country after about 15 years. And so this guy's now kind of looking for a place to be. So we're sharing vision. We're inviting him in and waiting to see, could this be someone? We just need one person. It's the power of the one that I don't actually need a big gathering, anything like that. I just need, I'd love 3 disciples,
Yeah.
Got a young guy now who's a little younger than me, who's a seeker, that a neighbor introduced. He gave my number to him saying, "I don't know what you do here, but I think you probably could teach him English. He needs to learn English." And I thought, oh geez, I don't want to, I don't want this guy to think I'm his free English teacher. But I met with him for the sake of my neighbor. We actually hit it off great, became good friends. Shared my testimony with him, the gospel, first time we met in the conversation. He's been reading the word some. He's on the journey, but he's starting to weigh out, hey, he's asked me, what does it take what do you have to do to believe in Jesus? And if I become a Christian, do I have to tell everybody? And so he's a successful professional guy working a kind of like regional sales job in a big international company. He's a really sharp guy, really kind, very connected sort of guy. And he's just taken a real love to me and to my teammate here. And so we're just praying that we just continue to share, continue to invite him in. And it's that's the way this thing is progressing, fits and starts little at a time. And we're just trying to kind of do right by whatever the Lord puts in front of us and keep looking,
Well, thanks for listening. And if you're enjoying the Movements podcast, why not take a moment to let somebody know about it? This has been Steve Addison for the Movements podcast.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.